It's a pleasure to be here, here being the Upper West Side of Manhattan on the island of Mannahatta, home of the Lenni Lenape people, and it's part of our respect for time as well as for place to acknowledge that the life of the institution, the Bard Graduate Center, does unfold on the ancestral and still living homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. We're here today with Michael Chazan from the Department of Anthropology of the University of Toronto. And he's here really on the occasion of the publication of this book, The Reality of Artifacts, which we'll hear more about later. Michael has been a professor in the Department of Anthropology since 2012. From 2015, he's been the coordinator of the Material Culture Program at Victoria College at the University of Toronto. And from 2008 to 2018, he was the director of the Archaeology Center. He's also an honorary associate of the Evolutionary Studies Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's been a visiting professor of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and at the Institute for Earth Science of the Hebrew University. He's been the recipient of many grants, including two very large multi-million-dollar grants from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He's excavated in France, in Israel, in Jordan, in Egypt, extensively in South Africa, and we'll hear more about that later, as well as in Camden, New Jersey, that notable site of archaeology in the United States. He is the author of several books, 2006, Domesticating Space with E.B. Banning, New Research on Neolithic Architecture in the Middle East. Also World Prehistory and Archaeology Pathways Through Time, which was first published in 2007, and it's in its fourth edition with Routledge in 2017. In 2015, he co-edited a special issue of Archaeological and Paleo-Environmental Perspectives on the Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa for the African Archaeological Review. And as I said, most recently, the Reality of Artifacts, an Archaeological Perspective, published with Routledge. He has many papers, many papers in both professional, more general journals and chapters in books. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Chazan.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I'm going to try to keep myself to about 20 minutes. Now that I see the panel, they're all much more interesting people than I am, so I'm going to try to leave time there. I'll just say I'm going to share the screen now. So, I'll just say that this is a bit of an oddity for me. I'm usually talking to archaeologists about why material culture is important or how I look at material culture and artifacts. This is, I think, the first time I've talked to people who do material culture and to tell them about why archaeology is important. So it's really exciting, actually, because that was a lot of the goal of writing this book. The archaeologists who are on the panel all are engaged in material culture theory and have been for a long time. But I find that one of the goals is that there's a disconnect between the archaeological community, which has been doing a lot of the field's been advancing very significantly. And all of those ideas and knowledge and information that we've been gaining over the past decades isn't, in my experience, permeating its way through into the discussions in material culture theory, which I find to be very dynamic and active. So that was some of the goal of this book, was to try to bring in some new perspectives from not my own, some of my own research, but more generally things going on in archaeology. But the perspectives are very particular and idiosyncratic, and I'll lay them out, but they come out of my own experience. This is a personal project in the sense of my trying to make sense of the world that I experience, and based on a lot of my experience being working on archaeological sites, particularly over the past 15 years at this massive cave site of Wonderwerk Cave. We're looking from the entrance of the cave towards our excavation area. This is an area that had been previously excavated. We've come back to do very fine-grained, very precise research. It's a large stalagmite at the front of the cave that started forming about 40,000 years ago. The walls of the cave have rock art, both geometric art and depictions of animals. Most of this goes back at most a couple thousand years, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years at most. This figure on the lower left is particularly interesting. It's a part animal, part human figure, a transformation figure, which is quite common of rock art of Southern Africa. And that one in particular might be a bit older. But a lot of our research is focused on the front of the cave, this area, excavation 1 behind the stalagmite. This is a 3D model of the entire cave, a plan based on a 3D model. And in excavation 1, and then I'll be talking to you just about excavation 6, which is in the back of the cave, and just the scale there, that's about 140 meters from the front to the back. This is a pretty big place. In the front of the cave, we've been focused on deep history, the basal layers there. This is a model based on photogrammetry, and all those tickets are paleomagnetic dating samples by Ron Shar. A big effort has been determining how old the different layers are in this site, which is not easy because the basal layers go back to about 1.8 million years. This is the earliest cave site, cave occupation site, I should say. There are earlier places where stuff fell into a cave, but people actually lived here or spent time here. I don't know how you would describe that, going back 1.8 million years. And we've been studying that sequence for the past 15 years. Right around here in stratum 10, we documented early traces of fire, which is the oldest documented human use of fire on an archaeological site. And we're now in the process of working on evidence of fire going back to the earliest layers about 1.8 million years ago. All this work goes on in a contemporary context of post-apartheid South Africa. And I've also had the chance to learn about that world, and that's kind of challenged my thinking quite a bit. And one thing is the difference between the local concept of an emphasis on the history of struggle versus our conception of history, which is really based on origins. The struggle is, of course, most recently, the struggle against apartheid, but it goes back further into the 19th century, which is struggle against early colonial, British colonial forces. And there was this short-lived rebellion led by a man named Luca Junkie, and it was not successful. He came to a very unhappy end, but this is a monument put up in the town of Kuruman a few years ago, that anytime I talk to a local group about history and heritage, this is what they want to talk about, is aspects of this resistance history that there's a lot of local pride around. So that's been an interesting thing to think about. And we do a lot of work trying to connect with local communities, give them a voice, space that we don't completely try to monopolize this place. And this was our most successful event, where we had a day with drama and music. This guy here was on South African Idol, so he was a big local celebrity, and he came. It was amazing. And just these are people from Kuruman, about 30 kilometers away, most of whom had never been to the cave, and the cave was alive with their ideas and their music, and it was really just a great day. So that does affect my thinking as well. But a lot of what I'm talking to you today about comes from this experience, both at Vonderwerk and South Africa in general, and in previous archaeological experience of working on just a wide range of archaeological artifacts, we'll call them that. And in South Africa in particular, I have the opportunity to work on some of the earliest artifacts in the world. These are Oldowan stone tools from South Africa. And just as an aside, it's terribly challenging about our early Oldowan assemblages. It's all very, very small stone tools, about 1 to 2 centimeter in size. A number of questions. Why were they making such small things? How did they use them? And for me, some of you know me, can relate to this. How did they not lose these incredibly small things? But small objects are actually a under-recognized part of the very early human toolkit. It's not uncommon to find that. But also I work through the whole sequence, actually, including colonial contact. We've been working at a site called Canteen Koppie, which is the first diamond mining locality in South Africa, so an early contact site between colonial and local populations, where we have things like porcelain, but also glass, European glass that's been chipped for use as scrapers and other tools that previously had been made out of stone. So what's come out of this? I'm going quite rapidly because I do want to leave time for discussion. Is this book, which it's short, so I'll tell you that. You know, the main thing I can say to speak in favor of my book is it's not that long. But kidding aside, there are a number of basic ideas that underlie it. The first is that artifacts are an essential component of the evolutionary context that led to the emergence of humans. Artifacts aren't an add-on to human evolution. They're the context in which we got the selection for the traits that make modern humans. The earliest stone tools are 2.5 million years old. There are arguments for one site that gives evidence going back to 3.2 million years old. The earliest evidence for our species, Homo sapiens, is about 300,000 years old. That means that there's well over 1.5 million years of artifacts before modern humans emerge. So if you take away and say, what are we in our essence? I think Andy Clark's term of naturally born cyborgs captures a lot of truth, that this is part of our evolutionary context. From my perspective, then I had to think about, how do I define artifacts? I guess I didn't have to, but I wanted to. And I came to a somewhat unorthodox decision, which is that I don't think it works to define artifacts as a kind of thing, but it's rather a status that things have through their engagement with humans. That when humans engage with objects, and actually a lot I talk about temporality, when we bring objects into our human temporality such that they have a past, present, and future, they take on this status of artifacts. This means that artifacts is a kind of status function as defined by Searle. I like his ideas a lot about status functions in terms of institutions, but Searle is very focused on language. You know, he's a philosopher. You know, there's a reason the world needs material culture people. Apologies for that. Just working at home has its negatives. So Searle focuses on language as something that makes something have a status, an institutional status. So the court is now in session is often his example. But I think gesture does the same. I don't make a hand axe by saying this is a hand axe, although actually I, as an archaeologist, do. But people who made the hand axes made it through the gestures of making the tool and chipping it away. So I think that one thing I bring to this argument is that you have to expand Searle's ideas, and that's how you get artifacts, is by including gesture along with language as the way that humans interact with materiality. And finally, there's kind of a circularity to this, the same way that artifacts are part of our evolutionary context. they're also part of our personal context, that artifacts as things that we engage with in this kind of way become deeply embedded in who we are. They're really deeply significant in the emergence of the sense of self. They're not, again, something that can simply be removed. They're something that becomes part of how we think about who we are in a very essential way. Although, of course, they're not the same as our body parts, because you can use this example. It's from Greek philosophy that you can hang a cloak on a hook and it's still your cloak, even if you're no longer with it. You can't hang well, most of us can't hang our hand on a hook. Okay, I'll keep going and we can come back to that. Kind of topics I talk about is the role of cognition. A lot I talk about typology, how things come to have different kind of organized forms. This is a beja bowl, a bread baking bowl from Egypt, Old Kingdom Egypt. It's an early topic I worked on, a topic that I worked on early on in my career. I talk about artifacts in the body. This is a Roman slave collar, which is an object that comes to speak, in a sense, for the person by being attached to their body. But again, luckily for the slaves, in some cases, they could be removed. So that's another theme. Another is what I've called here intangible artifacts. It's things like fire, and particularly fire. Can we think of fire as an artifact? How does fire move into human existence? What are the limits of what I can do with things that I can't exactly touch and hold? Water, fire, things of that nature. And then, of course, to think about the autonomy of artifacts, which I think a lot of people writing about material culture have argued for this agency or autonomy of objects. And I'm actually arguing quite the opposite, that it's the human engagement that makes things artifacts. But I do think that autonomy is an emergent property of the artifact world. And this is a particular case. Often it's very unhappy when artifacts become autonomous, the golem in Jewish folklore, or this is a case in the Moche culture in South America, in the Andes, where the artifact world comes alive and kills all the people. So, often artifact autonomy is not a very happy thing. So again, very briefly, I want to talk about one example of ideas that I have that touch on a very central question, which is the nature, just a little problem that I thought, that I thought I would solve, but I'm kidding, obviously, that the origins of art is obviously a kind of big topic. And it's not that I think I can solve it, but I think I can offer a different perspective. And that comes partly from my ideas about artifacts, but partly from the unique context of Wonderwerk and the very back of the cave. So we're looking from the middle of the cave backwards. It's a beautiful picture by a South African archaeologist named Royden Yates. And this is us pondering the meaning of existence, looking at the back of this cave, 140 meters from the entrance. This always was the back of the cave. There's not another entrance nearby. You'll just have to trust me on that right now. The occupation of the back of the cave is about 500 to 300,000 years ago. There are a lot of technical issues with the dating, which is kind of a next step of our research. But we're fairly solid that that's the time zone that we're in. So this is preceding the emergence of modern humans, or in the period leading up to the emergence of modern humans, of our species. It's about 250 to 300,000 years before the earliest object that's identified by anybody as symbolic or art-like. This is the Blomboz Pebble from the coast of South Africa, which is a piece of ochre incised with a pattern. And it would be about 30,000 years more earlier than the earliest figurative art. So this is really quite early. And what we find there, it's quite early, but it's quite late in general in terms of, if we compare this with the first appearance of artifacts. We don't find this kind of thing in the Acheulean, in the period of hand axes that precedes it. We're in the very back of the cave. And one question is, why are they there? I'll come back to that in a minute. But they're bringing with them stone tools, normal stone tools, animal bones assumed for consumption, unworked slabs of ironstone from outside the cave, but also more exotic things like quartz crystals, what you see on the left, including large quartz crystals that can be used to make stone tools, although these I don't think were, and also very, very small quartz crystals. So it makes clear that what's being brought there are quartz crystals intentionally. Also ochre, some of which has been worked, and specularite, which is a speckly iron mineral. It produces this sparkly powder. And you can see that this one shows very clear signs of working on its base. So the question is, what's going on here? Why are people going 140 meters to the back of the cave? This is a picture by my former student, Jane Wilkins, who's now in Australia. It really captures the feeling of this place during the daytime. There is light that penetrates. It is an uncanny feeling place. It's very still. And at night, I don't know if a place can be very dark, but it's very, very, very dark. It's kind of a sensory deprivation spot. At night, you see strange things if you sit there for too long. And when you come out of the cave, if you walk out of the cave at night, the light of the stars is just overwhelming. It's a very special feeling place. And it's hard to avoid the sense that the reason that people came there was because of the feeling of the place. And that some of the materials that they brought there were there not because of their functional properties, but because of their sensory properties of quartz and ochre and specularite. Okay, so it could be that these are like bowerbirds, that humans just collect shiny things. Bowerbirds are in Australia. They're a problem for historical archaeologists because they'll take the shiny things off the site and they'll kind of create a bias in the assemblage. But bowerbirds do this out of an evolutionary trajectory of bowerbirds. It has to do with mating rituals. It can be tracked through their broader range of nest building and kind of performances that are done in a mating context. We're not birds. We have very separate evolutionary trajectory from birds. So I think that the Wonderwerk phenomena has to be understood in our evolutionary trajectory. And the thing that jumps out for me is that what characterizes humans is we work on the basis of invisibles. That means that I project things into the world that I can't see. And the most important of these is a theory of mind that I can't see. Well, I can see little snippets of you, but I infer that at the other end of this computer screen, there are people who are bored out of their skulls or are having this great revelation about the nature of material culture or just getting on with their lives. But I infer that you're there and that you have a perspective that's different than mine. This is something that we do inherently, and that's very unique to humans. There are arguments that maybe chimpanzees also have a theory of mind. It's kind of a complex argument. But certainly chimpanzees have elements of a theory of mind in that they have self-recognition, which is very rare in the animal world. So my idea for Wonderwerk is that what we're seeing is an early stage of humans extending that invisible projection onto materials. That basically people are seeing quartz and specularite, as well as the place of the cave itself, and projecting a kind of a power or essence to it that's not inherent in the material itself, but that it's part of their engagement with the material, that the material has a power. And power, I know, is an odd word to use for it, but it's the only one I've been able to think of consistently. I see that today with local people I speak to about the cave. in Swana society, the cave is the home of Nochayametse, the water snake, who lives in deep caves and caverns and water sources. Nochayametse is a snake, but not exactly a snake. It's an entity, it's an essence. It's a thing that's dangerous, that you must respect. But in an amazing exchange, one guy once told me, well, it won't hurt you because you don't believe in it. You know, and that catches for me the central point. It's there because you believe that it's there. That belief is that projection of invisible. So my idea for art is that underlying the idea of art is this projection into materials of power. Art is, in a sense, just a wrapping of that and a containing and a giving form to that. But this materiality for me underlies the phenomenon of art. So that was quite rapid. So I'm hoping that there are comments or questions or that will further the interest. I do get financial support, so I thank those various sources. And just to give you a sense of the landscape that we look out, particularly this is during their summer, which is it's what we would be seeing now, which is the rainy season. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So since I'm seeing on the screen the name David Morris, I want to also thank Michael for putting me in touch with David Morris for a different project, but out of the Wonder Art Cave. I guess in site 1 at the front, Michael had come across some years ago a million-year-old hand axe that had been renapped. In other words, had been repaired for further use. And we're going to be borrowing that object for Conserving Active Matter, an exhibition that a bunch of us here have been working on for a while, that'll be opening next year, where it'll be a kind of star piece right at the beginning to demonstrate that there was conservation before there were humans. That's how central a notion it is to, just to play with Michael's notion, the idea of the human emerging from the interaction with things. So we're now going to have a little conversation. I just want to introduce on the panel, as it were, in the room around the table, a couple of my colleagues, Casper Mayer and Meredith Lynn, also an esteemed alumna, Antonia Bien, and some visitors, Yanis Hamalakis, who is a research fellow this semester, coming to us from Athens, not alas from West 86th Street. We're all somehow banished from that at the moment. Also Michael Shanks, who's been a regular visitor and will be back again next year as a visiting fellow. Michael, can I ask you to unshare your screen at the moment so we can all see each other?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
That's okay. So Michael Shanks will be visiting next year. And then we have Nathan Schlanger coming from Paris, where he's professor at the École des Chartes, and will be publishing his edition and translation of the essays of André Leroy-Gourand on technology, coming out next year in Cultural Histories of the Material World, with a very extensive introduction of its own. So questions from the panel before we turn it over to the audience? I'll start to give everybody a chance. I want to ask just a general question, Michael, and it's actually one that's good for the panel too, given that it's stacked with archaeologists. And the question is really thinking through the book, but maybe more generally, what do you think that archaeology in particular brings to the multidisciplinary study of material culture?
Thanks, that's a lot. And I don't think archaeology has had quite the impact that it should. Archaeology has advanced in the past few decades in two directions. One is analytical, is just sheer ability to understand things about materials. And that's significant. The power of archaeological science is impressive. And there's a lot of kind of insight that comes out of that. The other is that I think that archaeologists have done a lot of very good work in thinking about what's involved. Well, Nathan would be one example of this, would be one person thinking about the relationship between the making of things and their use and their nature as objects. So looking at things is very dynamic, and looking at things that come out of, and questions about cognition and materiality. I think some archaeologists have done some very good work. Some archaeologists, not so much, that I'll admit that that's true. And then, I'm sorry, I said there would be two things, but there's a third. A third is just sheer information, that there's a huge, well, let me put it this, maybe use this as an example, is, the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard is a really amazing material institution that brought together all of the animal world in the 19th century to allow people to study what it is to have an animal world and to organize it and understand the nature of evolution. 95% of the record of the material world is archaeological, is prehistory, is parts of the world we usually don't think about. And to not draw that into material culture studies, I think is it leaves us seeing a real sliver of the whole. So that's maybe a bit arrogant as an archaeologist, but would be the perspective that
Thanks.
Yeah.
Peter, can I just ask a question?
Yeah. Sure.
First of all, as you know, this is my first appearance in this kit, so I would like to thank you all for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to many, many thought-provoking and interesting events. And thank you, Michael. It was a very interesting and very, very rich talk. There are lots of issues here we could discuss. We can talk about temporality that you mentioned briefly, but I think is central to everything you were saying. We can talk about, of course, your central tenet, which is that objects and people are co-evolving in human history. But I want to ask a question about your last slide in your last thesis about invisibles. I was very, as you may gather, very pleased to see the central layer of sensoriality in your argument, the sensorial properties of objects as central to their coexisting with humans. But I'm a bit uneasy about your notion of invisibles, because that assumes a universalist, cross-cultural, and also cross-historical notion of vision and visibility. And on that, I have problems with. As I was writing my book on the senses, I realized something that many scholars know, that there are different ways of seeing and different notions of vision. So I guess we are, modern humans that have a specific notion of, modern visuality in our kind of sensorial apparatus. So to what extent our notion of vision and visuality was shared by the people in the context you're investigating? Even in our own context, if we think about different notions of vision, like apparitions, like dreams, like ecstatic visionary kind of phenomena, there is not one singular and generally accepted idea of vision. So what you describe as invisibles, perhaps they were not invisibles for the people in that context. I don't know, what are your thoughts on this?
thank you. My thoughts is first, I don't want to give a glib answer because what you've raised is very serious and very is. So one reaction is one of the most interesting parts of doing this book was learning a lot about vision and about how wrong our folk ideas of vision are. Simply because the eye can't process that. The eye actually processes information. It's not just in the brain, but the brain and the eye as a combination can't process information the way that we think that it can. It's just way too much information. There's all kinds of sampling that happens. There's so much that we fill in that we think we're seeing a constant visual stream, but we're not. We're actually inferring and filling in gaps, you know, kind of, I don't mean this is simplification, but, you know, our mind kind of creates JPEGs all the time. And if you blow them up, that's not really there. I think why, you know, that the hard part of what you're asking me, and this is, there's been a lot of debate in archaeology about ontologies, which is a word that I have a lot of difficulty with, but is that I do accept that there is, in a sense, a physical reality. And I use the term invisibles in the same sense that Searle would say, well, a room with tables and a person in a robe and a wig is not a courtroom unless we believe that. So it's not the, now I can imagine a counter argument to that, which is, yes, it is in a sense, because our belief has made that real. But I see that division that he makes works for me, that no, there's the reality of it, that this is a red sparkly rock, but no, it's not that, that's the physical chemical reality of it. But no, that's not what people see at all. And I can give you the perfect example for that, which is the insanity of mining for diamonds, which transformed the entire region I worked in. There's no value to diamonds whatsoever, except they're hard. So it's useful for an industrial process, but a large diamond, absolutely nothing of value to it, except it really does have value. But that to me, so it's real, you know, people will kill for this. So, you know, yes, it's real. But to me, that's a different kind of reality. And that's the reality that it's only real because we're there. And not me necessarily, because I actually don't care about diamonds. And I can't tell you how much it's affected me to stand with people who explain to me. They're not joking or they're not being metaphorical. The cave is the place that this powerful force lives, that they think of as a snake. It's real. I mean, David Morris, who he mentioned, tells this story of standing with a woman on a site that's a open air rock art site, that they're polished boulders that people have over, there are thousands of incised. And this woman, he says, you know, he's talking to a local group of students and he says glibly, now some people think that we're standing on Nechoya Metze, on the serpent, that's what people, that these stones that emerge from the water are actually, and this woman had a panic attack. You know, they had to resuscitate her and, you know, it wasn't make-believe. She heard that and that was reality. So what you're raising is really complicated, you know, and I agree, but there's this part of me, and that's where I'm kind of on Searle's side, that there's a brute reality, he calls it, and there's an institutional reality. But I understand that some people would dismiss that as being wrongheaded. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, it's not a great answer to say
Thank you.
I can't.
Nathan.
Thank you. You can hear me, yes.
I
Thank you. Sorry, I just crashed for a few minutes, which will bring me a question about artifacts and how you stop becoming an artifact and all that. But first of all, I thank you, Peter, and thank you, Michael. And it's great to see friends around here, and it's great to see Wonderweg Cave again, because I'm probably one of the few who has been there. And you remember Michael hosted by you for a whole day. It was absolutely absolutely fantastic. And I just heard you mentioning about diamonds and things. So as you know, the story goes of the archaeologists who go around La Bibreuil and Van Wietlo and others in the 30s, and they look for artifacts. And one day, disappointingly, Van Wietlo writes to his colleague, today we found nothing, only diamonds. And that was a big disappointment because they were looking for hand axes and they found only diamonds. So I have two questions to you. First, the artifact that is a status. So can an artifact stop being one? I mean, is it a status that is transient? And is the transience of the status dependent on the absence of an actor? And if it is dependent on the absence of an actor, that means that in the debate since Alfred Gell and others about agentivity, you certainly deny agentivity to the artifacts, because if there is no human agent to activate them, then they stop being artifacts. Yes, that's a question. And then if you want to answer this, and then I have another.
Okay, let me answer that, because it's and it's so nice, Peter, among other things. Thank you for letting me see Nathan, who I've known for a very long time. And so yeah, so that's a great story about I didn't find any artifacts. My answer is absolutely yes. It's a transient state of being. And I often use in my teaching, since I'm in New York right now, Paul Auster, who has a beautiful, just incredibly moving passage about cleaning out his father's house after his father's death. I just find it so, it's not as an archaeologist, if I have my archaeologist side and my human being side, it speaks to my human being side. He talks about this weird feeling of packing up his father's stuff, you know, and I kind of use condoms, which is awkward, you know, or not, you know, old, you know, razors and personal items, and putting them in garbage bags and putting them out on the street. I think we've all had this experience, you know, and it speaks to me a lot that it was so emotional. And basically he was saying these things were artifacts, what I think of as artifacts, while his father was alive and inhabited them, or they inhabited him, or however you want, you know, that they were part of his life. Now they're not, they're garbage. I absolutely think that artifacts' status is dependent on the human actor to view them. And I use an example. I spent a day at a garbage dump that's an archaeological site called Hebron in northern Israel. And I was looking in a garbage dump for pieces of rock that were artifacts. And I'm very good at this because I've been doing it a long time, or I think of myself as very good at this. So I could identify artifacts there. If anybody else could not. And I take them and I put them in a bag with a tag, because that's what archaeologists do. So for me, I was taking objects and creating artifacts. I was creating artifacts because of the affordance of these objects to allow me to study the past. There are things that allow me access to that, but I'm recreating them. That for me, the act of archaeology is actually a creative act. While they were in the soil, in the ground, no, they were objects in the ground. And yes, so as opposed to, for instance, Jane Bennett, I don't agree with her view of artifacts themselves doing that. I think it's the human actor who, if you want to call it, activates these things. And I can prove it by your area, actually, is the history of archaeology. In the 1820s, well, let me go a little earlier because, you'll correct it. In the 1750s, stone tools in the ground weren't recognized as artifacts of human manufacture. That's something that gradually emerges through the 18th and really into the 19th century. So in this quarry, until I had the contemporary, and this goes back to Giannis's, until I had the contemporary vision of what a thing can be, it couldn't be an archaeological artifact because there was nothing for it to fit into. So it's observer dependent. It's absolutely observer dependent. And we have what we call diagenesis in archaeology, the chemical reorganization and physical reorganization of objects in the ground, their crystalline structure. So for instance, at Katu Pen, where I excavate, another site we work on, there's this incredible process of artifact diagenesis, where objects are being melted into a silica gel and then reprecipitated. But I've looked at so many objects, I can tell that, wait, that was an artifact, that was an object. I can use that as an artifact. And so I put it in a bag, I label it. So it's very nice because it's a speech act actually, because I'm putting a label on it. So yeah, so my answer is absolutely. I think that artifacts can go in and out of artifact status quite happily. And just because a thing has been made by a human doesn't make it an artifact. By my kind of odd particular definition, which is, admittedly odd and particular. Yeah.
Nathan, can I jump in? Nathan, I want to jump in because there are a couple of questions from the audience just on this point, and I want to string them together before your second question, which I will get back to. But first I want to say, Michael, it sounds like that what you're proposing here could be interestingly thought of not as a kind of commodity cycle a la Uncle Carl, but the artifact cycle, because there are different stages in it, right? It moves in and out. So here are the two questions from the audience about this. One is from Aaron Glass, and Aaron, it's your second one on the list. If artifacts gain their status as such from their association with human users, are they still artifacts when they're in a museum collection? Mm-hmm. And what is the status of a museum collection in the artifact cycle? That's the first question. And then the second question comes from Harley Greco, who's an artist in residence at the BGC right now.
Let me answer that one before I forget it, because it's an amazing question. That's a really, I've thought about this, but I don't have an answer to that. That I think that museums are, in a sense, a mechanism that we create to extend our ability to connect with these things. That museums, what's the critical thing in a museum is the record that's associated. So for me, museums are very much about a particular kind of speech act of recording the thing. I'm so struck, for instance, I spent time at the British Museum, where if you want to look at stone tools, they have to bring out a drawer one at a time. And there's 6 stone tools, and you can only pick up one at a time. And some of these come from sites that I've spent a lot of time at that are littered with stone tools all over the ground. So something's transformed and they're becoming museum objects. And my kind of sense is that what's working at museums is this connection between language and the object. And that allows us the capacity to create massive collections of objects that still retain this artifact status, far beyond our capacity, in our daily life. Although I will say in our daily life, one thing I'm struck by is, so in Greek philosophy, you do get these statements about artifacts, but it's usually one thing. But we have capacities. I've never cataloged how many objects I connect to, but it's in the thousands, that we have the capacity to connect to a lot of things. But it's a really interesting question that I haven't really thought through completely. Yeah, and the second question.
The second one, from an artist's perspective, she writes, I'm intrigued by your idea of artifact status and how it would compare, say, to Walter Benjamin's concept of aura in artworks. The aura being the singular experience. So is there a singular experience in the artifact cycle?
I don't know. I'm sorry that I keep saying, but these are such profound kind of questions to me. One of the very interesting parts essential to Searle's argument is what he calls joint intentionality, that it's not a singular relationship between an institutional fact and the individual. And I do find that the experience of artwork as an object of art, you all would know a lot more than I do, but doesn't involve just my experience of that object, but some kind of general acceptance of what art is by a larger group. So I'm not sure that there's a place where I have this unique relationship between, my mug, but although it's my wife's mug, but it's, so I can own a thing, or I can have a unique connection like Paul Auster's father to his things, but it's part of a more general social kind of group having that. So it's not quite an individual process. I don't know if that gets at the answer, but it definitely fits with the idea that what an artist does is an emotional act of creation, that the act of making a thing is a personal connection. And I think that's true for a lot of, I know a lot more about craft than art. I think that's true of a lot of craft work. I don't think it's very true of a lot of machine work. And that's something that I think is very particular. So I hope that responds somewhat. Yeah.
Okay, and now Nathan, back to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I imagine. So I'm going to please my my publisher, yes, and mention a bit André Leroy-Gourhan and this forthcoming book. And André Leroy-Gourhan did write a very famous book called Gesture and Speech, where precisely these two entities that you were playing with initially in one of your first slides are articulated in some way, yes, in 1964-65, and it's been translated in 1993, I think. And in this anthology that we're going to publish very soon, there are some preparatory text, actually, 15 pages article that condense the book as a whole, so it's easier to read the 15 pages than the whole book. But André Leroy-Gourhan also is a very good example. The question about the object in the museum, what status does it have there? He started his career at the Musée de l'Homme, where there was a sort of ideology, an aspiration of the ability to transfer the object from it far away into the museum while keeping its soul. Yes, they are talking a lot about necrology. The museum must not be a place of dead objects. You must be able to keep alive the object. How so? By documenting where it comes from. But there's 10 entries fish that you actually, for each object, you have to tell the indigenous name and the place where you found it and description, etc. That's 1930s. By the 1960s, Leroy-Gourhan has completely despaired. And he although he still around the museum, but he doesn't believe, he says that the object is dead without the people, without the gesture, without the dynamics without the emotion that accompanies it. And that what you should do in a museum is recognize the museum should not aspire for an ideal, but recognize its limitations and say the role of the museum is precisely to show you the gap between what an artifact might have been or what an object might have been in its artifactual status, according to your terminology, and what we see now. And it is precisely this gap that the visitor should be able to capture and to meditate about, or this is a message of the museum is precisely this gap, not an attempt to gloss over it, but to emphasize it. So that's an interesting, and the last point I want to make, because there are other people, is that in Wonderwerk Cave at the very bottom of it, you have this collection of mysterious objects. And Leroy-Gourhan also found a collection of objects in 1949 in La Grotte de Lienne, and he, a slightly different mindset than yours, and that's interesting to compare. He says this is a sort of Mousterian bric-a-brac. Yes, the Mousterians collect fossils and pyrites, etc. And this is the origin of science. This is the beginning of scientific curiosity. This is the beginning when a semi-natural being like a sort of Homo faber encounters objects that stir its curiosity, and curiosity raises a question, and question raises a method, and the method gives you the modern science. So for Leroy-Gourhan, a collection similar a little bit to yours there is not the beginning or the instauration of a spiritual realm, but on the contrary, the onset of rational inquiry. Yes, what do you think about that? And that's it has been understood by Christoph Pomian, for example. Pomian and Alain Schnapp and all the other people who actually build on Leroy-Gourhan's first collection. Yes, what does it mean to collect? What does it do to one's imagination that you are collecting things?
Okay, so very briefly, thanks. And Leroy-Gourhan is a big force in all of this. One thing I would say is, so I think about the previous question about museums, given the light of, then in a way, all of us who have spent a lot of time in museums know how transient they are. It's almost like the forces of entropy are always there, knocking on the door, and the bags break and the labels disappear, and there's almost this sense that I would have, if going back to that previous question, that a museum is an effort to freeze the artifact status, to keep, the natural mortality that Auster documents from happening. And we're always losing. I think all of us who have spent time, it's a losing battle, that stuff is so much and it's so overwhelming. That's different from the exhibit side that you're talking about, Nathan. This question of science, it's a bit outside of my realm, but I would question whether curiosity is a great word. And maybe curiosity is a better word than what I've been using. And that I don't see a great distance between different kinds of curiosity. So the curiosity that leads to a scientific impetus, well enough, but the same curiosity can lead to other, like Yannis was saying, other beliefs or other practices. And where science comes from is a question I'll leave to someone else. That's a different kind of larger issue.
So that's I just want to say it's 1:15, and I'm fully cognizant of the fact that some people have to go, whether to class or to work or any place like that. Feel free to just disappear. And it's been great having you here for what's been a wonderful conversation. And for those who want to keep going, we'll go on for a little bit longer. So Casper, you had a question for
Yes, I will have to
Michael?
disappear soon too, but I do want to ask this question. And it's probably an easy one. It's about fire. And I know you're thinking a lot about fire still now after the book. So, but it relates to, I've been reading with my students last week, just an essay by Vernon on work and technology in ancient Greece. And interestingly, he doesn't use the category of the artifact. He uses tools and implements. And on the implements, he includes fire, but also things that grow, plants. And it's kind of a really brief passage. It's 2 or 3 sentences, and it might also be not very well translated. And it didn't make sense to me at all at the time. And I think maybe it makes sense to me now after your talk, but I do have to ask, to what extent does fire, if you're including fire under the category of the artifact, where do you end? I mean, do you include plants or things that grow, animals, humans?
Yeah, no, you've hit the problem, and it's, there's a big problem that with what I'm saying is, where does it end? And I think you've hit the Achilles tendon of this whole thing. Is then a sidewalk an artifact? And that's an Achilles tendon for people who say it's an object of human manufacture. Is the electrical grid an artifact? There's a point where it extends outwards. I did write quite a bit of, is an airplane an artifact? It seems absurd to say that. So there's a problem. And I find the use of status as opposed to kind gets you a little bit out of that. Yeah. But fire, I would argue that fire is a natural force. It's a thing in nature. We've been learning that more and more. The idea of including it as a tool, it's just really interesting. And the use of terms, looking at the world in terms of tools and implements, is just a different way of looking at it than I have been using. And it's equally valid. And it's Leroy-Gourand does a lot with, things that are transforming energy and whatnot. Yeah, it's a problem, is where do you then draw the line? And what I prefer to do is just saying, I'm not in the business of drawing lines. But that's, when you do come up with idiosyncratic ideas, you become very aware of their weaknesses. And this is the biggest one for me, is where does it end? Then is the whole landscape an artifact? That's absurd. So it's a problem, that really is challenging. And for me, when I'm thinking about fire, I'm thinking about it, a process of human engagement with fire. And there coming a certain point in that engagement where fire is contained and manipulated in such a way that we can start to think of it as something of an artifact. But it's a bit, it's, to put it mildly, problematic. Yeah. So it's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Casper. Other questions? Meredith.
Thanks so much for this really exciting talk. I wanted to ask about maybe the role of context and thinking about the importance of context for archaeologists, locational context, by that I mean. And so, one of the ways in which I imagine you thought about the quartz crystals that were brought into the cave and characterized them as artifacts is because of their location within a cave nearby other objects that were maybe more clearly artifacts, whereas outside the cave, if there were crystals in some other location, they wouldn't have been recognized probably as an artifact. And perhaps, so I wonder about that, sort of what's the role of context, determining the relationship, and then also if context also might have affected or played a role in why those early humans or proto-humans collected the quartz crystals to begin with from whatever place they were in.
Yeah, no, those are, so of course, so for archaeologists, context is everything. And, the most beautiful example of this is in Blomboz Cave on the coast of South Africa. in layers well below this early incised ochre, they found a collection of objects, a large shell with a piece of ochre. They found 2 of these caches with the ochre and some animal bones. And each of these objects by themselves is just junk. You know, it's just another thing. But together they tell a story, and they're really about people bringing things together. And that act of assemblage, I think, is quite significant as a precursor to symbolic behavior. You know, that you're bringing these things into one place. This kind of, the second question you asked for the early sites, I can't say anything, you know, that where they came from, you know, whether they're bringing associations, I can't say. That we do that, I know, you know, that's so much the way that we act. You know, things have value because of their associations with the past. And we know this archaeologically, you know, and that goes back to Peter's question about, you know, what's the value of archaeology? There's just so much good work on objects that have a value because their rootedness in deep time or in traditions out of the archaeological record, so that we know that this isn't a modern phenomenon, that you know, that something comes from a special place. One example I used in the case of odd objects is water from the Holy Land, right, which was a commodity of sorts that you would collect in these pilgrims' flasks. So archaeologically, we have the flasks, we don't have the water. But that association of place and power from a place, I think is very important. It's funny now that we talk about it, that I had I just can't explain how great it's been. It's one summer I've missed in South Africa, and I won't be going this year probably. But one year I drove, there's a man who was working with me who was very knowledgeable about the local history. So I wanted to drive him to Kimberley to see the museum because he'd never been there. So we drove and we stopped by the Vaal River, and he got out and he ran down to the river, and he had brought with him this Coke bottle, an empty Coke bottle. I had no idea. He came back to the car and he was kind of embarrassed and laughing about something, but the Coke bottle was full of water. And I kind of asked him, what's that about? Because his friends were kind of teasing him. So he belonged to the Zionist Christian Church, which is a big denomination there. And they attach importance. They believe in aspects of this deep, you know, water sources. So the Vaal River, the water from there has power. So he was collecting it to take home because he'd never been to this river, and the water was this thing. So, you know, that kind of, I hear what you're saying, you know, that definitely it's something that I think it's one of the key ways that we connect with stuff. You know, I have this strange idea that, so humans, you know, this is Paul Ricoeur's idea that humans have past, present, and future. You know, we inhabit a world simultaneously of past, present, and future. The natural world does not, other than humans. And I think that part of how we connect, we bring these objects into ourselves, is these objects have this past. You know, my mother used that, or I got this as a present for my birthday, or this came from a really cool place that has, you know, all those things. I think that's how these things come to be pulled into our lives. And it's why they come to be so important to us, even though they're just stuff, you know, in a sense.
Well, that's, I think, a good place to end. There's a lot of thinking still to be done, and it's been wonderful, Michael, being led through some of these questions, through the hard reality of the places that you dug and what you've come up with and how you've been thinking about it, to all of these questions that are not easy to answer, but much worse not to ask them and then not to tangle with them. The tangling is itself what we do. So thank you very much for talking to us today, and to people on the panel and to those in the audience. And we look forward to seeing you again and talking some more soon. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Nice
bye.
to see you.